In the shadowed streets of Roman-occupied Alexandria, around the year 49 AD, fear whispered through the Christian community. It was the reign of Emperor Decius, a man who had decreed that all citizens must offer sacrifices to the Roman gods or face the wrath of the empire. For Christians, whose loyalty to Christ forbade such sacrifices, this meant death. Among those caught in the crosshairs of imperial cruelty was a devout Christian woman named Apollonia. She was not a rebel, not a soldier, not a preacher shouting in the streets. She was simply a believer, a respected woman of her community. Likely in her 50s, Apollonia was known for her faith, intelligence, and quiet dignity. But none of that mattered when the mob came for her. According to letters written by Dionysius, Bishop of Alexandria, the chaos began when a group of pagans, emboldened by imperial orders, decided to make examples out of local Christians. Apollonia was seized during one of these purges not by soldiers, but by civilians, citizens who had once lived beside her. They dragged her into the street and beat her until her body was broken. Then, in what would become a signature moment of her torment, they shattered her teeth with stones and fists, leaving her mouth bloodied and torn. This moment is well documented. Her broken mouth wasn't just a sign of violence, it was symbolic. Apollonia had, in the eyes of the mob, spoken heresy. The destruction of her teeth was the destruction of her voice, her witness, her ability to proclaim the gospel. They didn't kill her outright. They had something else in mind. The crowd dragged her toward the outskirts of the city. There, among the sun-scorched sand and wine-worn stones, they had prepared something far worse than a sword or flame. A box, not a coffin in the traditional sense. This was a custom-built structure, narrow, claustrophobic, its interior coated in thick resin, sealed tightly except for a series of holes no wider than a finger. But before placing her inside, the mob introduced the second half of her punishment, a swarm of desert bees, gathered from nearby hives, furious and trapped in clay jars. In Roman Egypt, bees were feared and revered. They symbolized pain, death, even divine punishment. The jars were shattered, the bees released. Then, with the insects buzzing furiously in the heat, Apollonia was forced into the box. She screamed. She begged, but it didn't matter. They sealed the box shut with ropes and clay, leaving only the tiny holes, just wide enough for air to pass through, and for the bees to enter. Then they buried the box halfway into the burning sand, ensuring it baked under the Egyptian sun. We know these details not from legend or folklore, but from early Christian correspondences and martyrdom narratives that were carefully preserved in church libraries. Especially in Alexandria and Antioch, they describe her torment with brutal clarity. The bees, disoriented and furious, attacked the only warmth they could find, her flesh. Trapped in darkness, Apollonia was stung again and again. The pain would have been unspeakable. Not immediate death, but constant agony. Bees don't kill quickly, but enough of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, stinging over hours or days, especially in an enclosed space, could cause the human body to swell, convulse, and slowly shut down. The toxins would spread. Her throat could have swollen shut, her eyes sealed from inflammation. And even then, death wouldn't have come fast. Suffocation, heat stroke, and shock would have slowly overtaken her, according to one surviving account, written decades later by an early bishop. Apollonia was heard praying from within the box, muffled, faint, until the prayers faded into silence. Her body was never recovered, or if it was never publicly buried. The Roman authorities denied any involvement, claiming it was the will of the people. But the Christian church knew exactly what had happened and preserved the truth in their letters and oral traditions. Apollonia became a martyr, canonized by centuries of Christian historians. Yet her method of execution was so strange, so cruel, that it was almost forgotten. And here's the part that historians often overlook: this wasn't just random sadism. In Roman culture, especially in Egypt, punishments were often symbolic. Bees weren't just dangerous, They were used in rituals and curses. To bury someone alive with them was to invoke pain, silence, and the illusion of divine wrath. It was also a method of making a statement. By dying that way, Apollonia's death became more than a punishment. It was a warning, a message to others. This is what happens when you refuse to bow. But in trying to silence her, they accidentally amplified her. Her story outlived the emperor, outlived the Roman Empire. And while the world forgot the details for centuries, they were never lost. Today, historians and theologians are re-examining these lost martyrdoms not just for their spiritual significance, but for what they reveal about human cruelty. The use of bees as a weapon, the transformation of insects into executioners, the way punishment can become performance. Apollonia's name still survives in some Christian traditions, but few know what really happened to her. The church remembered her as the patron saint of dentistry because of her shattered teeth, but the rest of her agony was sanitized, erased, and now uncovered once again. This wasn't just a death. It was a biological execution, a fusion of nature and cruelty, silence and screams. It shows us that history isn't always written in grand wars or royal decrees. Sometimes it's buried in a box, beneath the sand, filled with buzzing wings and fading breath. What makes Apollonia's execution even more haunting is how intentional it was. This wasn't a sudden mob fury or a chaotic execution gone wrong. It was premeditated. The preparation of the casket, the gathering of bees, the chosen burial site. Every element served a purpose, carefully designed to prolong pain while stripping away dignity. Roman Egypt was no stranger to spectacle. Executions were often turned into events, sometimes in arenas, sometimes on city streets. But Apollonia's death was different. It wasn't meant to be seen by the crowd, but rather felt by the community. The horror of it spread through whispered stories, the way trauma always does, invisibly and deeply. The casket she was placed in was never meant to offer mercy. Historical engineers analyzing ancient Roman coffins describe how the tight, curved interiors restricted movement. Arms pinned, legs twisted, spine compressed. Add the sting of 100 bees, the baking dessert heat, and the fear of slow death, and you begin to understand the unimaginable mental and physical torment she endured. Roman punishments often focused on symbolism, and in this case, Apollonia's fate served multiple messages. First, it punished the mouth, the broken teeth, the silence in a sealed coffin, and the swelling from stings all targeted her ability to speak, to evangelize, to bear witness. Second, the bees, nature as chaotic soldiers, were weaponized in a way that fused the natural world with human vengeance. They became executioners themselves, not by tool or blade, but by instinct. Third, and perhaps most significantly, was the burial itself. The Romans knew the Christian belief in resurrection. They knew that burial rites mattered deeply. By entombing her in a box, sealing it, and burying it beneath the sand without ceremony, they were not only killing her body, they were attempting to deny her soul rest. It was the ultimate form of erasure. And yet, she was not erased. The early Christian community of Alexandria did not forget her. Within just a few years of her death, stories of Apollonia's martyrdom were circulating in secret gatherings. Underground churches would whisper her name during communion. Her broken teeth became relics. Tiny shards were passed among believers, hidden in lockets, buried in grave goods. By the 4th century, Apollonia was being invoked as a spiritual figure across the Eastern Church, not just as a martyr, but as a symbol of endurance, someone who withstood torment without betraying her faith. Her story, passed down from generation to generation, eventually reached the West, where she was formally recognized by the Catholic Church. But here's what's most fascinating. Over time, the story of the bees faded. The church emphasized her dental torture, portraying her as the patron saint of toothaches. Images of her began to appear in cathedrals, usually holding a golden tooth or pincers. Never a casket or swarm of bees. Why? Because some parts of history are just too dark to keep in the light. The horror of her real death was perhaps too much, to raw, so it was softened, cleaned, sanitized. Until now, modern historians, digging through letters and forgotten martyrdom manuscripts, have rediscovered the full account. The bee-filled casket, the screams, the burial, these are embellishments. They're sourced from early church documents hidden away in libraries in Greece, Syria, and Egypt, written in the careful hand of monks who dared not forget. Why did they preserve these details? Because Apollonia's death, as cruel as it was, represented something profound. It exposed the terrifying lengths to which regimes will go to crush dissent quietly. It revealed how nature itself could be turned into an instrument of pain. And most of all, it showed how a single voice, a single woman, could terrify an empire simply by refusing to recite a few words of loyalty to false gods. And perhaps, in some strange and bitter way, the cruelty of her death amplified the strength of her faith. Apollonia's execution also poses a haunting question. How many others were buried like her and forgotten? How many deaths were not recorded? How many boxes were lowered into the sand, sealed with screaming breath, and left to vanish in the heat? We often think of ancient torture as impersonal: swords, crucifixions, fire. But this wasn't that. This was biological torture. Nature weaponized. It was intimate. It was slow. It was invisible to the crowd. It left no marks behind, no public body to be paraded, no ashes to mourn. It was, in every sense of the word, psychological annihilation. And yet, Apollonia resisted until the end. What little we know about her thoughts come from those who knew. Her early church members wrote that her faith never wavered, that she recited fragments of scripture from memory even after her teeth were broken, that she told her executioners she was not afraid, that when presented with a chance to recant, to bow, to live, she chose instead to die. And that, perhaps, is what still terrifies us about her story. She wasn't forced into martyrdom. She walked into it, painfully, yes, but willingly. Because to her, living in fear was worse than dying in faith. So what happened to the torture box? Where is it now? No one knows. Like so many artifacts of ancient pain, it's lost to time, burned, buried deeper, or perhaps, like her story, waiting to be rediscovered. But its legacy lives in whispers, in writings, and now. In this retelling, in the centuries that followed, Apollonia became more than a martyr. She became a quiet icon for those who suffered in silence, for women silenced by violence, for believers persecuted in secret, and for anyone whose pain was buried out of public view. Her feast day, February 9th, is still honored by some branches of the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. But again, the focus is usually softened on her broken teeth, not her burial. The sanitized version of her martyrdom became the public story. Yet beneath that sanitized version lies the darker truth. A woman who died not only for her beliefs, but by one of the most symbolically cruel methods history ever recorded. And now, over 1,700 years later, the box has been metaphorically reopened. Her story forces us to confront how history handles pain. What gets remembered? What gets erased? And what becomes legend only after the horror is trimmed away? Apollonia's real story: bees, heat, darkness, silence, reminds us that persecution is rarely grand or glorious. It is often quiet, hidden, dismissed, just like she was. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it hits harder than myth. The Romans wanted her forgotten. The church remembered her differently. But today, we remember her fully, in all her agony, courage, and brutal martyrdom. The box may be gone, the bees long dead, but the message remains. Even in total darkness, even in unbearable silence, the human spirit can still scream. And sometimes, that scream echoes for centuries. Welcome to Torture's Room, where the darkest corners of history are brought into the light, no matter how long they've been buried.